I'm now going to be passing it over to Kerry with Oregon State University's fire program. And this is very fitting because she's going to be kind of moderating our fire and forest health segment. So, Kerry,
Yeah,
passing it to you.
thanks. Thank you so much, Margaret. Like Margaret said, my name is Kerry Berger, and I'm with Oregon State University's Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Fire Program. I am the fire program manager. And just a really quick shameless plug for the fire program that we are a team of 8. We have a director and a manager, and then 6 regional fire specialists who have been strategically placed across the state of Oregon to serve every county. Our work really focuses on fostering the resiliency of communities and landscape to wildfire at scale in the state of Oregon. So it is my extreme pleasure to be the moderator for the fire session today, and also my pleasure to be introducing first Dr. Kerry Metlen, who is a senior forest scientist for the Nature Conservancy in Oregon, where he engages with diverse partners to provide scientific grounding for forest management decisions supported by robust monitoring and ongoing adaptation. He shares that he has the good fortune to work at state and regional scales in support of the Nature Conservancy's dry forest initiatives. And at more local scales, he helps lead forest adaptation efforts as part of the Rogue Forest Partners working together for resilient forests and communities. So Kerry, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Kerry. Most excellent. Okay. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here. And to be clear, I'm pinch hitting for Chris Adlam, a key member of the fire team down here in Southwestern Oregon. So here's just a quick photo to give everyone a little context. I'm down here in Ashland. My office is over here in the corner. Here's a prescribed burn, an action that's going on as part of, measures to protect this municipal watershed, improve forest health. This is the kind of thing that I am very involved in a lot of the time. Typically, we talk about thinning and then the importance of pulling in fire as a key component of that. And why is that? Well, first of all, I want to really thank Brent and all of the previous panelists for really doing a good job of teeing this up for me, because I think that the parallels of the 1930s are really fascinating. Here we have a letter written by one Clinton Walker, who grew up in Northern California. His father and he were both big loggers, and they worked for the Red River Lumber Company. And back in the 30s, they had this drought that Brent just mentioned, and man, they were having some troubles. And there was an ongoing debate, a debate that we see playing out at national scales, and a debate we're still sort of locked in. And that debate is, can you do effective forest management using just mechanical means, or do we really have to get process fire into the mix? And so here, Clinton, who clearly grew up with fire, if you get a chance to read this letter, it's fascinating. He talks about trying to get permission to run some prescribed burns, being told no, doing it anyway, having the authorities come out and see what he'd done, and they're like, yeah, that's great, but it's just too risky, we can't do it. So Kenneth is a Yale-trained forester who is taking the approach of improving forest management, and he wants to reduce density. He wants to think about the root disease and the insects. But as Clinton is explaining here, it's as if he is identifying protruding tongue, black and blue face, bulging eyes. And he's trying to treat those things. But there's a tourniquet around the throat of this patient, and that tourniquet is the lack of fire. He goes further, and I couldn't agree more. If a forest can resist beetles and rust and other pests for 500 or 1,000 years, and then when we start putting them out effectively, these pests move in and become a big issue for the forest, then a very reasonable assumption is that this is a direct cause. What we see around this big old ponderosa pine, in a picture taken 1 year later, after this letter was written, we see all these firs coming in, incredible densities. We see some holes, which are probably, I assume, some foraging of the woodpeckers that are going after the insects that may well have actually invaded this tree well in advance of these loggers trying to cut it down. And so for this talk, I want to sort of get into some of the factors. What is it that fire is doing in order to really ultimately improve the overall health of the forest. So little level setting. First of all, I just want to acknowledge, we all know there are different kinds of cutting. Here we have a thinning as opposed to a clear cut. I want to be very clear that also fires are not all the same. So as an example, here we have severe fire as contrasted with that prescribed fire that I mentioned earlier. They were literally one ridge away, similar seasons, but under very different conditions and with very different ignition patterns. And of course, very different outcomes. So for a lot of this talk, I'm going to be talking largely about prescribed fire, although more extreme fires are also part of the natural system, just in their right proportions. Why do fires matter? In this conceptual figure, I'm trying to get at time since the previous fire, because we know basically, and you'll see in some of the many graphs that I've got coming up, that fire impacts are of course ephemeral. A fire happens, its effect dissipates over time. But the severity of that fire is determined not just by time since fire, but all these other local and regional fire controls. How have fuels accumulated? What is the landscape context? Is it on a ridge, mid-slope, or a bottom? Where did that fire get ignited? Was it the bottom of the ridge or the top of the ridge, etc.? So when we think about doing prescribed fire, oftentimes we're over here, relatively recent times since the previous fire. We are working in already fuel limited systems. We're lighting from the top of the ridge and we're pulling it down. But up here, you could have multiple severe fires in relatively short order. It just depends on the conditions on which those fires are ignited. Over here, we have relatively a robust local controls on fire. So that might be fire suppression, that might be a lot of humidity, but then every once in a while, the climate aligns and you get severe fires. So we know that there are all these controls on fires. And one of the biggest controls on a subsequent fire's effect is, was there a fire before that and how long ago? This is a meta-analysis that I'm part of right now. The reviews are back. Hopefully it'll be in press soon. But in this paper, some colleagues and we did a literature review of what's out there. And we did a very careful meta-analysis to see what happens when we have different treatments. And then that is then followed up by a subsequent wildfire. And so this is the change in wildfire severity. So if this treatment hadn't happened, then the wildfire severity would be at 0. So these are compared to controls. But instead what we see is that the thin and burn is very effective at reducing wildfire severity. So a mechanical treatment to rearrange fuels and to reduce fuels, and then that's followed by a broadcast underburn. And we see a very significant reduction in subsequent wildfire severity. And that even persists for over 10 years if you look across the literature. A thin plus a pile burn, a different kind of fire, has a similar effect. There's really strong evidence that prescribed fire alone can actually dramatically reduce subsequent wildfire severity. Now, a caveat I would say to this is that there are oftentimes preconditions on where we're doing prescribed fires. And so that is a consideration when we are thinking about that particular result. Wildfires have widely ranging effects, and I acknowledge here that it would have been nice to have actually teased out high severity wildfire from low severity wildfire and the subsequent impacts on future wildfires. But the fact remains there is a subtle response. And then if we only do the mechanical work, what we see is we can kind of reduce future wildfire severity, but not much. And so once again, what this robust meta-analysis of the literature shows is that fire is essential for altering future wildfire effects. We see some evidence for this in my neighborhood. This is the Ashland watershed. Again, I'm right about here. That's where I'm currently standing. And these are just monitoring data. So before treatments in the bright red, you see long flame lengths. And then after we did treatments across that watershed, you see a lot more blues and less reds. And here you see just the change in flame length after we do density management, surface and ladder fuels, or these mechanical treatments plus an underburn. So again, burning is absolutely critical for modifying fuels. And this persists into the long term. This is a somewhat challenging slide to get through, so stick with me. 2002 is immediately after some thinning and some underburning that was conducted in Montana. 2022, so 2 years later, we can see real differences in these different treatments. This particular study was confounded by actually an extreme bark beetle mortality event. And so we actually see probability of torching, for example, going way up in the controls. That's because of this interaction between stand conditions and insects. But if we look at the thinning treatments, these are the M's, M and M plus F, the probability of torching doesn't really go up. And where we look at the interaction between thinning and underburning, what we see is probability of torching was extremely low in 2002, and it's only modestly increased by 2022. So we see that this is an important convergence. Stand structure, species composition, and process, the fire, can really make a big difference for probability of torching and then probability of mortality when a subsequent fire comes through. So this obviously has huge implications for the process. We're foresters, we like to think about the long-term forest dynamics. And so the process of what happens when you have a fire come into a system. And this is just a nice conceptual model here. This is an initial fire excluded condition because we know a lot of our forests are fire excluded at this point, although getting to be fewer all the time. If it goes at high severity, and this could be clear cut, then the potential to reburn at high severity is much higher, and then you can get stuck into a destructive cycle. If your initial entry is a low or moderate severity, that opens up some options. So you can have mixed or low severity fire that sort of maintains a more open state, similar to those we would have found historically. Or if it gets more high severity, you can actually loop right back down into this more destructive rather than a virtuous cycle. Is it really true? Well, I'm quite confident that Craig Bienz, my colleague who's going to be speaking in a little bit, will show a picture not unlike this one. But I think this was some real proof in the pudding for those of us that work in Oregon. And so here, the Nature Conservancy, Lomacotsi Restoration Project, the Klamath Tribes, and the Fremont-Wainema National Forest have been collaborating to do work at a landscape scale. And what you see is that when the bootleg came along, the bootleg fire really responded to those treatments well. Where there had been no treatment, we have active canopy fire, the canopies are consumed. Where we only did the thinning and hadn't got around to the underburning, well, it wasn't as intense, but a high proportion of the trees were still killed, although you will see some living trees. And then where we had done both, we had restored structure, species composition, and process. We have a wildfire, an extreme wildfire coming through and just doing good work. Clearly, this sets the system on an entirely different trajectory. So now I'm just going to rattle through a number of studies that basically provide empirical evidence for some of these important processes that fire provides to the forest. So here we're looking at a really interesting study that went to the Sierra Nevada National Forest. Well, that might not be true. Southern Sierra Nevadas, and to northern Mexico, the San Pedro Martir, Sierra San Pedro Martir. Sierra San Pedro Martir had a active fire. Oh my gosh, I'm such an idiot. No, I'm not. We're good. Okay, Sierra San Pedro Martir is down here. So where we had an active fire regime up into the 90s, we have a very different spatial pattern and relative vigor of the forest. Up here, we have the Southern Sierra National Forests where they have been fire excluded. And what you see, and I admit it's a little challenging to see, is more openings in this active fire regime. You see perhaps more individual trees, those black circles. You see a lot fewer dead trees. Those are the red circles. And you also see a lot more openings. And those openings are really important to both disrupt the flow of fire and get canopy fire back on the ground, as well as to regenerate future cohorts of shade intolerant species such as pines and oaks. So what we see in this picture on the bottom is a forest with active fire regimes where spatial patterns are different, tree mortality is different, species composition is different, and it's really being driven very much by fire and active fire regime. And then up here, we see forests that previously had active fire regimes, but then the management shifted, the indigenous Native American management was disrupted, we got an increase in density, and thus a very different kind of forest, different spatial patterns, different species composition, and different function. Speaking of function, we all know soils are critical. And so here is a nice paper from the Fire and Fire Surrogate Study, where we're looking at how does soil nutrient dynamics function. And here we see a fire suppressed forest where vegetation inputs, litter, bark, etc., really kind of bind the soil nitrogen up. Nitrogen and phosphorus are harder to get a hold of. But then when we put fire back in that system, a fire maintained system, those plant cycles or those nutrient cycles open up and you get more available nitrate and ammonium in this instance. And here is just showing the ephemeral nature of that. So the treatments happened with this red line, and then over time, you see immediately in the burn and the thin and burn treatments, this pulse and nitrogen mineralization, nitrogen nitrification. Okay, so that's basically nitrogen that's now available for plants to take up so they can be more healthy and resist insects and disease. And then after 20 years go by, you see no real differences among treatments. And this gets at the importance of being fire maintained. These aren't systems that persisted in a static nature. Unsurprisingly, I suppose, burning brings in beetles. And here we see an array, these different acronyms down here. I could have spelled them out. Jeffrey pine, red turpentine and Jeffrey pine, mountain pine beetle in sugar pine, red turpentine beetle in sugar pine, a beetle that gets into the white fir, and a beetle that gets into the red fir. And the dark is burned and the gray is not burned. And what we see is, yeah, in these fires excluded forests, when we bring in fire, we bring in beetles. And sometimes, and there's a species preference to that, some species like the white fir are actually more susceptible. So they're even more likely after fire to be attacked by insects. So burning brings in beetles. However, long-term, it really changes things. And so this is a ponderosa pine study in Montana. And if you first look over here on the right, what you see is that you have resistant and killed trees. There was a major bark beetle epidemic. It came through, and then when they looked at the trees that had resisted that attack versus the trees that had been killed, they had a lot more duct area. They had more ducts, which allowed them to push more resin and allowed them to resist the bark beetle attack. So then, stepping to the left, I apologize for the flow of this slide. What we see is burning increases your duct area in contemporary forests. So before and after, you have significantly more duct area if you burn. And here, that comparison is made in two geographies, but in forests where you have before 1925, so you had more active fire, and after. And what you see is that historical forests, so you can go and you can core the wood and you can look at the old wood of those trees that were persistent in a more active fire regime had more duct area. Thus, we infer they would have been more resistant to beetle attack. So fire calls in beetles, but fire also is a necessary process for making pines, ponderosa pines at least, more resistant to future pine beetle attack. The Native Americans were well dialed into this. Fires can improve acorn quality. And this is a nice study that was done with the Karuk and the Yurok down in northern California. And what they found is when they burned, they really changed the amount of filbert weevil that was getting into their acorns. And so you have here caged and uncaged acorns, because they were also worried about just straight up predation. And so you can see that, caging mattered, but an even more important factor was, had burning been in that system, the burning in the previous year, consuming the litter, consuming the larvae and the moths. And then the next year, when the acorns come down, a greater proportion of them is actually available to be consumed by humans and by wildlife. So you see then again, a major long-term cycle that is disrupted with fire exclusion. But if we had fire in that system, more healthy acorns would be available. Unsurprisingly, fire drives species composition. So Andrew's going to be talking in a little bit. This is his slide, but this is simply comparing historical, so active fire regime to recent, so fire excluded fire regime. And these are different classes of forest that he identified. So where there's persistent ponderosa pine, recent Douglas fir invading with fire exclusion, recent grand fir, again, invading with fire exclusion, and then persistent shade tolerant stands. And what we see across the board is that under an active fire regime, you have a lot more ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. And then with fire exclusion, you see these incredible increases in the white fir and the Doug fir, depending on the system. So fires drive species composition. That species composition, as we know, is really important for insects and disease. And all of it comes down to stand development. And so this is from a paper by Alan Tepley, but Andrew has also done some really good work here. I just chose this as an example. So you can see these different arrows are different kinds of fires: underburn, low severity, and moderate severity. You've got different species. And then as we start from basically a fire excluded stage, the amount of fire in that system, and this is even a relatively moist system, means a lot for ultimately what kind of forest develops over 5, 10, 50, 100, 200 to 500 years. So fire absolutely drives stand development. So what's it all mean? It means that historically we did have these landscapes being stewarded by frequent fire, and a lot of it was relatively mild. In the green here, we see where from the land fire data, we have done our best to map where frequent low severity fire regimes persisted. And no, it wasn't just Eastern Oregon, it was also Southwestern Oregon and some of the fringes of the Willamette Valley, and certainly a large proportion of California. And these are areas where we've seen extreme changes due to fire exclusion. But even in some of these other areas, these long, severe fire regimes, I think the more we're learning a lot more all the time, and if I'm not mistaken, Andrew's going to talk about this, that some of that red as currently mapped in forests, at least in the Northwest, may not have been as long and severe as we thought. Actually, there might have been some fire in there maintaining those landscapes. And why not? This two-legged, it was sort of all over the place, and they knew how to work with fire to improve forest conditions. And then, of course, we have an ample amount of lightning to light up, as we all know, this wide swath of geography. So between indigenous Native American management and natural fire regimes, fire was an incredibly important component of the Pacific Northwest and the forests that were here when we started logging them and putting out the fires. And so suppressing wildfires actually leads to future wildfires. And so as well-intentioned as Smokey Bear has been, I think we need to acknowledge that we need to get back into more of a virtuous cycle where we have low intensity disturbances that incorporate the functionality of fire. And that allows us then to have healthier forests. Here we see just from Paul Hesberg's paper in 2019, some photo evidence of the kinds of changes we see when we take fire out of the equation. None of this is a surprise to anybody. And then this is from the Missing Fire paper that I was a part of. But across the Pacific Northwest, when we look, we see less than 11% of expected fire extent. I mean, this was actually going all the way back to, I think, 2016 data. And so that's changed. We've had the bootleg. We've had some really large fires. We're catching up. But I do think that an important caveat is the proportion of severities. And we see that historically, in these systems, we would have had more like 6 to 9% high severity. And now we're seeing more like 36% high severity. And if we harken back to those cycles I was showing earlier, has really big implications for how these forests function. So, is there something we can do about it? I wasn't asked to talk about what we can do about it, but I work for the Nature Conservancy and we really care. So with the fire environment, ultimately fires are driven by the weather, the topography, and the fuels. We can't do much about topography, but in this historical oak woodland, we sure could have done a lot about the fuels as well as the weather, because we can decide to light fires under relatively benign conditions. And honestly, I guess we can work with topography as well. This is a fire that started on a hot, windy day at the base of the slope and of course went canopy. If it had been ignited at the top of the ridge and then worked back down, very different outcomes would have happened. But we need social support, we need capacity, and we need to do adaptive management. And so here's just a couple of slides so that I can, sort of help us think through, what does it really mean? Thinning is important. This is a stand in the Ashland watershed. We went through, we took out a bunch of the firs that had come in with fire exclusion. Is this complete? You won't be surprised to hear me say no, because we need the thinning plus the controlled burning in order to stimulate that process, to get the nutrient cycling going, to open up regeneration opportunities, to significantly reduce the wildfire hazard. So then here's an example of an oak woodland where maybe we did a light-handed treatment mechanically, but then we came through and we did the underburning. And things are going in a different trajectory. And it's time to retake this photo because you can actually see a bunch of regenerating shrubs. And so that regeneration opens up different kinds of opportunities for browse. And my point there being, we're not sterilizing the understory, we're stimulating regrowth. Here's another example where we did some overstory thinning, and then we came through and we did some underburning, and now this forest is just moving in a different direction. One final shot, where we've done a little bit of thinning, we've done some underburning. Now we're opening up more growing space so that the plants can be more healthy. As we saw, for example, from that acorn example, the fruits of those fruit-bearing species are expected to be of a different quality, and this forest is moving in a different direction. And here's more proof in the pudding. This is very similar to that bootleg photo. This was a series of treatments that were done up in northern Washington, where ecological thinning followed by pile burning was actually followed by a wildfire. And that wildfire actually resulted in tremendously nice outcomes. And so if we can get fire back into the system, we can change how we are interacting with fire and how fire actually supports the work we do rather than kind of pushing us around.
Kerry, you have about 2 minutes left, so if you could start wrapping up.
Any questions?
Amazing. That was fantastic. Well, Kerry, if I were on the fence about fire, I think your talk definitely would push me over that fence, because you really showed the importance of fire on the landscape. And so we'll have time for questions during the Q&A, which happens here in just a little bit. So hang tight, folks. Kerry, you gave a really nice segue into our next speaker, who is Rich Fairbanks, who is a landowner. And Rich has held various positions in the Forest Service fire organization, including interagency hot check crew foreman, suppression crew foreman, division supervisor, and others. Retiring after a 32-year career with the Forest Service, Rich works 6 years for the Wilderness Society, leading their California fire program. He currently owns a small forest management company, primarily engaged in wildfire investigation. He studied fire behavior as a graduate student and has his master's degree, and he owns 20 acres in Southwest Oregon, where he does considerable underburning. Rich, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Kerry kind of set it up for me. This is a much simpler approach. There's no charts at all in this presentation, but I think it'll kind of illustrate where a lot of private landowners are going in Southwest Oregon and probably in a lot of other places. So if I could have the next slide, please. Or there we go. Okay, so these photos are all from my little 20 acres. And the larger picture in Southwest Oregon is a lot of good things are happening with prescribed fire. Next slide, please. We now have a prescribed burn association. Somebody told me it was the first one in the state. I don't know, but anyway, they have a lot of clients. I'm proud to say I was the second burn that they did after John Gallego, my neighbor. And the PBA has a lot of support from the community, from just my neighbors, people I talk to, and from ODF and other agencies. I've been pleasantly surprised how much support we've gotten from them. Next slide, please. There's also at a very local level, like the Little Applegate, which is where I live, Little Applegate drainage here west of, 20 miles west of Kerry, there in Ashland. Prescription for Safety is a little group that got grants to treat fuels, basically thin pile and burn within 40 meters along evacuation routes. We didn't want our tires catching fire and stuff when we're trying to get out of here when there's a high severity fire. And I was amazed at the enthusiasm of property owners along these routes. And we've treated 210 acres so far, and there's a lot more people want to do it if we get more money. So Prescription for Safety is a real step forward when it comes to getting things set up for eventual controlled burns. Obviously, it's going to be a lot easier to burn that chunk on the right, the photo on the right, than the photo on the left. Next slide, please. We thought we'd focus today on this, again, this 120-acre property to kind of show where things are going. Obviously, I have a lot of fire experience, so maybe I'm a little bit ahead of my neighbors, but they're thinking along the same lines. I'm just so interested in how much people's attitudes about fire have changed. A lot of people want to burn. So here you see some classic Applegate dog hair that I bought. Next slide, please. And it's steep. I have some that's 70% slope, dry mixed conifer, Doug fir, pea pine, 5 different hardwoods, some sugar, a little bit of sugar pine. Anyway, when we bought it, my wife and I both work in forestry all our lives. So we established plots and we used that data to develop a forest plan. Next slide, please. And one of the first things we did was we built a trail system. It's very useful for a number of reasons, preventing spread of noxious weeds, a lot of things, but it also doubles as a fire line. Any good trail will also, you rake it off a little bit, it's a good fire line, especially for the low severity type fires. Next slide, please. So then for about 6 years, we did nothing but thin pile burn, dead prune the Doug fir, and then repeat until we had a canopy base height of about 8 feet and much reduced 0 to 3 inch surface fuels. There used to be, in this photo, a lot of the other photos, there used to be a old brush field shrub skeletons all through these dry forests from the last high severity fire, I would assume. Anyway, next slide, please. Yeah, so after we'd done a lot of thin pile and burn, we started underburning. Little patches at first, literally 1/100th of an acre type things, just letting piles creep and so forth. Next slide, please. Our main objective there was fuel reduction, understory fuels. But we also found it was amazingly effective at turning the 6-foot tall poison oak that was tickling your nose as you hiked around on the property to little rosettes down on the ground that weren't even flowering anymore. We maintained high canopy closure, so it was just the poison oak was unable to come back from the burns we were doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I say, we started small. There you see a trail. 1/10 of an acre burn was a big deal for me. Again, I'm doing this almost entirely just by myself. And it worked very well at that very small scale. We were reducing fuels, especially near the buildings, the house, and the sheds and stuff like that. Next slide, please. But in June of 2009, we had absolutely perfect conditions on our north slopes. And I was able to burn 2 acres in one day. And I know for all the agency folks that might be listening, that's just seems so small. But when you consider we've owned the property for 21 years now, getting 2 acres in one day was a big leap toward really getting the whole place in a good fuel profile condition. Next slide, please. So the Prescribed Burn Association came along in 2021 and burned a little over an acre. Oh, if you could back up, please. There we go. What really gratified me about this is I've done a lot of burning for the agencies. I used to burn clear cuts back in the 70s, and I did a bunch of backfiring when I was doing the hotshot thing. This was 30 volunteers. There were little toddlers. There were people who had people meeting their neighbors for the first time, even though they'd lived here for 20 years. That includes me. It was fun. It was also very safe. This is Aaron Krikova giving the briefing. It was a long briefing that emphasized safety. Nobody got so much as a cut on this burn. So I highly recommend if you want to do some fun burning, do it through a PBA. Next slide, please. Okay, so everything was going great. We're doing a lot of underburning. Probably had 8 or 10 acres burned total. And then the flathead borer came along. And after 5 years of drought, it was just incredible how virulent this normally fairly low-key bug, how much it was killing in my roughly 110-year-old Douglas firs. Phaenops drummondii, I had nothing to fool with. And since we had a power line right away, the PP&L got in here with the contractor. They were very nice, but they cut a lot of trees, and it is not their responsibility to clean it up after they cut them. They just cut the ones that might hit the power line, and then they get sued and put out of business, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of material got put on the ground. Next slide, please. And we took advantage of the fact that they wanted to cut all these trees. We got them to cut not only the ones that were obviously dead, but the ones that were sick and dying and had pitch streamers and such. So we got it kind of all done at one time. And we were able to, obviously these big logs are not really part of the fuel complex in terms of a flaming front of a fire, but they're in the way of doing anything with the 0 to 3 inch material. So you got to deal with them. So next slide, please. So we used a high lead, a primitive high lead, hippie high lead, some people call it, where we get a ladder that gets us up about 18 feet. We hang a block. We change the angle of force. We put a skidding cap on the end of the log, and we greatly reduce the amount of disturbance in cleaning up this material. Most of it was firewood. As you can see that little deck there, we donate it to a place down in Ashland. And next slide, please. And a small percentage of it was good saw logs. And this is my friend Bud in the hat there. He owns a mill, a wood miser, brand new wood miser. So he took it for me. And if you could press the button on the lower right, please.
All right, Rich.
Yeah, we're moving.
Let her rip. Got a little more. Stop. Yes.
That was the good part.
Yes, we're right at the bitter end on that.
So this is why I never really went into logging. I briefly did some logging, and the math was too much for me, measuring all those distances and making sure your cable was enough to stop before it got to the block, that kind of thing. But anyway, the point is we did get some usable lumber out of this, but it was almost all firewood. Bark beetle, they just dry out too fast down here. Next slide, please.
All right, Rich.
Yeah, we're moving.
Let her rip.
Okay, so by 2020 or so, we were burning some areas, like here's the driveway and near the house, for the third time. And you can see it's getting to be a pretty brush-free, fuel-free understory. Next slide, please. And in many areas, we were on our third burn, and it was looking pretty good. The overstory trees remained healthy. We have very little scarring, even in the smaller diameter white oaks you see there in the foreground, because we really controlled our flame length. I can really let her rip when it's pine and Douglas fir, but I know in places like where I have a lot of little pole-sized white oak, you got to stay down below about a foot flame length. Next slide, please. Okay. Ooh, I'm 3 minutes ahead of time. Oh boy. Anyway, we learned a lot in the 21 years that we've been managing this property, far more than I ever expected to learn. Little things like Fritillaria loves a good burn. Real pretty little flower we have down here. But anyway, underburning really is what you got to do if we're gonna save a bunch of houses, if we're gonna worry about the wildland urban interface down here where it's mixed conifer all around the houses, you've got to underburn. Thin pile and burn is not enough. It just doesn't reduce the fuels enough. It's a good thing, but it doesn't quite get the whole deal. Second thing is, again, with my volunteer work with Prescription for Safety and with various other, county extension and so forth, property owners really are ready for this stuff. They've been watching the Discovery Channel. They know that fire is good if it's, that it's a good servant and a bad master and all of that stuff. They're ready. They do need support. They need infrastructure. They need lawyers, guns, and money, however you want to put it. There's so many tools we really could use, spot weather forecasts, things like that, that would make this all so much safer and so much easier. So I guess my take home is, again, I think the public's ready to do controlled burning on their land. They need a little help. Okay, and that's, 2 minutes. Good. Okay, I'm done.
That's excellent, Rich. And I've heard you talk before, and I can't get enough of your story. Seeing, your property, the transformation of your property from what it was to what it is now, the health and vigor of your trees. It's a beautiful story, and I appreciate you sharing. The Prescribed Burn Association in the Rogue Valley is actually the first and only Prescribed Burn Association in Oregon. We are working to get more Prescribed Burn Associations throughout Oregon. In fact, Douglas County, maybe even in the Willamette Valley. So stay tuned for more information on that. So again, Rich, thank you so much for sharing your story. We do have some time now I think we have about 10 minutes for a Q&A session. And so I'm going to bring back Kerry because there's some questions related to Kerry's talk. And so You know, maybe because Rich, you just ended, I'll ask you a question related to your talk. So we have a question here. Are there any insurance requirements for private landowners to undertake prescribed burns?
My one experience with the insurance people, at least on my property, was they are totally uninterested in fuels other than the house itself. And they look for really obvious stuff like a shake roof or a deck hanging out over a steep slope, that sort of thing, or big piles of lumber under the deck, that kind of thing. They're not there yet, guys. They're not to the point where there's a lot of nuance. Now, the larger picture, I don't know, but my individual experience, they don't care.
Yeah, and so if I can just add to that, actually, I know that there is concern about liability and such for using fire, prescribed fire, whether it's pile burning or broadcast understory burning. However, there's some great movements in the state of Oregon to help protect landowners. And one of those movements is the Oregon Department of Forestry Certified Burn Manager Program. And so through this certification, landowners can become certified burn managers, but also contractors and others. If you are a certified burn manager or contract with a certified burn manager, that helps with reducing some liability on that. And then also coming up here, we're in a short session in the legislation, and what's going through right now is a prescribed fire liability pool of $5 million that landowners can pull from in the event of an escape fire, which escape fires are very rare, especially for broadcast or under burning. There's not a lot of studies that show escape fires because we do prescribe fire under specified conditions, under the right conditions, and we check all our safety boxes. So that is coming up in the short session. So I just wanted to put that out there. Certified Burn Manager Program. PBAs are a great way also to get involved there, and then a prescribed fire liability pool. So now I'm going to transition to Kerry here. When it says, going back to your slides, when it says just thin, no pile burning, is all the thin material removed from the unit, or is it left on site?
It's a good question. And, you know, this is a problem with a meta-analysis, right? A literature review. So what we did is we sort of had to go back into those published papers and parse them. And to the extent we could tell that they had done something with the fuels, then those got actually into that thin and pile burn, or that's really a fuels modification. And so the thin only in the slide looking at the effect of a treatment on a subsequent wildfire was more of a leaving the slash in the woods. And I would say this is a very well substantiated pattern where if you do mechanical work in the woods and you don't address the materials that you've produced, you can actually increase subsequent burn severity.
Yeah.
That
Also,
said, I would also say, like in the short term, like so the study I was a part of in Montana, we did a lop and scatter and we burned it a year or two later. And so there was a period of risk, a lot of risk. There was a lot of slash on the ground, but the burning partners were able to get it done and then off to the races. And so I think there are a lot of means for thinking about how you address those fuels, chipping, biomass, whole tree harvest, etc. But you really have to do it.
Yep. Kerry, let's talk about nitrogen. So we have a question here. How much of the forest nitrogen would we expect to go with the smoke during a fire?
It depends. I love being an ecologist. It really does scale with the intensity of the burn. So the higher the intensity, the more that the nitrogen will actually combust and be volatilized. So lower and moderate intensities, you actually get just the breaking down of the material, and you'll get a lot of that nitrogen and phosphorus being released into the soil, higher severities, higher intensities rather, then that leads to higher severity, you get more volatilization.
Mhm.
And I mean, that's kind of a similar answer goes to that question about erosion, right? A low intensity burn, which maybe even leaves some of that soil structure in place, maybe retain some of the bigger material, and definitely that allows some of the roots or rhizomes to persist. You're going to have relatively little erosion. If you've let it go really intense, really hot, then you're going to get more erosion. But I think there's good evidence to suggest a range of possible outcomes depending on the intensity.
Yeah. And thank you for that, Kerry. You just answered the other question. Was there any visible increase in erosion because of the biomass being burnt? So appreciate that. And like you, Kerry, us in Extension, our motto is to say it depends, because it really does under the situation, right? So one more question here. What are your suggestions for dealing with combative litigants that continuously claim that the Forest Service is only doing work, even in dry east side environments, for logging and boards? This storyline is one they use to set a frame and influence judicial perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really excellent question, and one that, of course, with the Nature Conservancy, we're committed to addressing. So far, our best solutions have come from collaborative approaches, right? Where we pull together multiple partners, articulating very clearly why we're doing the work, and then moving forward in a more concerted way. As an example, the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project, we moved, I think it was 4,000 log trucks through Ashland, the town of Ashland, heart of the timber wars, second maybe to Roseburg, and nobody complained. In fact, it was very much supported. So we work together to identify our values. We very carefully identify what are the risks to those values. Turns out some ecological thinning and prescribed burning is a very common remedy, but we still have to work towards that solution. And then I think there's a lot to be said. There are certainly some Forest Service projects or BLM projects that are developed with community input from multiple people, but then they aren't implemented collaboratively, right? They then make it a timber sale and off it goes. And I think those tend to get hung up, whereas using different mechanisms for implementing the work, like stewardship authority, allows partners to be more engaged and more involved in that implementation, in the feedback with the community, and that can sometimes help move things along.
Absolutely. So we have about 3 minutes left till we have a quick 5-minute break. So I'm going to just give the opportunity to all of you listening in to ask any other questions you have, or Kerry or Rich, if you have any like closing thoughts or anything you'd like to say before we transition to a break and then on to the other speakers.
Hey, can I just throw something in?
Yeah.
Yeah, this has been great, the presentations. I do want to suggest that if you're in research, I worked at big scales throughout my career. If you really want to have an interesting retirement, buy a few acres. It is fascinating. You will just learn so much stuff, and great upper body workout. The bark beetle, Phainopsis mundi, made me a stronger person because I had to cut up all those logs. So
How's your back, Rich?
yeah, really. Buy some acreage, man. It's amazing. It's an education.
And Rich, I wanted to say, you mentioned, oh, I did 1/10 of an acre, or I only did 2 acres. Those are really important acres. We don't have to always operate at large scales. And just think, you as a landowner do 2 acres, your neighbor does 2 acres, this neighbor does 2, it adds up. So if you're a landowner, don't get overwhelmed thinking, oh, I have to burn 100 acres. You can burn little acreage and still have great impact. So I guess I'll end this session with saying that just do something, do a little bit, it all matters. So now we're going to take just a really short break. please don't leave us. Come back in 5 minutes. So if you could come back by 10:45, we would so appreciate it because we have other great speakers lined up for you for the fire session. Okay, see you back in 5. Okay, that was a very, very quick break. Hopefully you all got up to stretch and take care of your needs. Let's get our fire session rolling with Craig Bienz. Hi, Craig. It's nice to have you online with us today. Craig catalyzes a fundamental shift in dry forest and fire management in pursuit of fire stewardship and protection restoration of cultural values through an ecologically based restoration paradigm that benefits both nature and people. He advances the system level changes needed to increase the quality, pace, and scale of dry forest restoration and beneficial fire use. Craig also leads multiple aspects of science, partnership development, tribal engagement, stewardship, and preserve management collaboration, and community relations in South Central Oregon. Craig, again, so great to have you with us today. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Kerry. Thank you so much. And I really want to express my appreciation for all that have been associated with developing this program, and the previous speakers for the great information that has been presented yesterday and today. Also, just to let you know, I'm Craig Bienz. I work for the Nature Conservancy in South Central Oregon. I work in the Dry Forest and Fire program that's supervised by Pete Calgary, who's basically lives in the Bend area. So thank you for this opportunity to be here and just share in this session. I'm here to talk to you today about the Bootleg fire in 2021. And so the Bootleg fire was the third largest fire in Oregon since 1900. It was the second largest fire in the United States in 2021. And the fire burned over 400,000 acres over about a month's period of time, a little more than that actually. And for many days in a row, these pyrocumulus clouds would form and you'd see them, and they were basically raising 40,000 feet plus into the air, creating their own weather patterns, just an expression of the severity of this fire, where over 70% of this burned with high basal area mortality. Of interest to me is in 1918, there was a fire similar size in this area, burning almost that same amount of acres, but as would have been expected, I guess, less than 10% of that was high severity. So we see this very significant change in fire behavior, similar sizes of fires, but very much very different in the behavior of these fires. And this just to show a few examples here. When this fire started, it was burning over 20,000 acres a day, and that condition actually got worse the latter part of the burn period, where it was actually burning over 25,000 acres a day. And in that situation, this example on the right, we actually had fire tornadoes that were recognized within the burn, tearing out trees that were over 40 inches in diameter, just tearing them out of the ground, snapping trees off, freezing needles on the trees, just an incredible amount of severity, almost to the point it was unrecognizable how severe this was. And the devastation was extensive, hundreds of thousands of acres under this level of high severity. So within that situation, it was really a question of, lessons learned. What could we pick out of this that was helpful to help give us information about what we had done, what we needed to do, and where we needed to go? As Kerry alluded to earlier, this was an example taken by Steve Rondo, Natural Resources Director for the Klamath Tribes, in an area where we had been working in partnership for over 10 plus years. And so just for reference, this is the Black Hills Supplemental Project Agreement under a Master Stewardship Agreement with the United States Forest Service. And in this project, we'll reference this multiple times as I go through here, coming back to this same area. But just for, and Kerry gave an introduction to this, so I don't think I need to go into more detail here. But down in this bottom left corner is an area that you'll see referenced 2 or 3 times as I go through here with different images. So this is another way of looking at these fires. And so on the left side, what you see is a false color composite. So the healthy vegetation is basically expressed in the red. And this was in the spring, right after the prescribed burn or controlled burn had happened. And then you can see the area in black where we had burned. Then after the Bootleg fire in October, that's the only place that's red, basically, is where we had applied fire in that same landscape. So you can also see this is the same location from that previous image taken by Steve. What I'd like to do is just provide you with some examples of how this fire burned through the area and take you on a short tour of stopping at 5 different places, looking at places that could give you examples of different kinds of treatments and the effects of the burn as it burned through those different areas. And so looking at areas of control where we had done no treatments, a controlled burn only, harvest in 2016 with no fire, harvest in 2016 with controlled burning, and then a riparian area. Just to give you a second to look at this, but this is our first stop. And this is an area where we had done no previous ecological thinning or controlled burning. And you can see the extensive devastation that's here, burning right down. So we've got bare mineral soil in many of these areas. And just the extreme severity of this burn for thousands of tens of thousands of acres. Here's another example then, our stop number 2. And this is for Robbie Flowers specifically, but in this area in 2008, we were having an extensive outbreak of mountain pine beetle in this area. So as a manager, I was given a choice of what to do. But you'll also remember in 2008, we had a very depressed timber market and the economy wasn't very prosperous. And so for me, the situation was one of spending $700,000 to $800 an acre to try to do a treatment or using prescribed fire. And I did the controlled burn here without any previous mechanical thinning. Yes, it was controversial, and many people thought that this was really the wrong thing to do. But then looking at this same stand 13 years later, you can see that not only was it important that we use that fire to reduce the density and effects of pine beetle, but also 13 years later, we've got a stand now that is basically in good health. In this picture, we're back in the Black Hills Project area. This was an area that was ecologically thinned in 2016, but without controlled burning. And you'll remember in 2019, basically we had a couple of years in there where COVID was keeping us from being able to use controlled burning. And so this was an area that we had planned to burn, but we hadn't been able to get into. On the picture on the left, you'll also see there's a kind of an orange water bottle and a yellow paint can. And so we've been monitoring these areas for a number of years. And those are areas where we actually have ponderosa pine seedlings. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit later. So here's an example then where we're looking at an ecological thinning in 2016, followed by controlled burn in 2021. This is the same picture you've seen with Steve and with the infrared color. We had within this area established some objectives to reestablish the historic forest structure and composition using the examples from data. We had reconstruction plots from 1850 and then bringing it forward. And so you can see the example of how in 2023 we actually had retained that forest structure and composition as it was in 1850. In this example, then, I wanted to show you also the importance of managing these riparian areas. So the picture on the left is before the burn. The picture on the right is following the burn. And the important part of this really goes to how these areas are also important. This site is only about 200 yards away from the area where the fire tornado had come across the top of Long Creek. And so here, adjacent to those areas where such extreme fire behavior had occurred, when it came into this riparian area, it dropped down. the importance of this is a stream, Long Creek is a stream that has threatened bull trout in it, which require cold, clear water. Temperatures less than 50 degrees basically are essential. And within the Bootleg footprint in the North Sprague core area for bull trout in this area, over 60% of the populations appear to have been extirpated because of the fire, because of sedimentation, loss of riparian vegetation, and warmer water temperatures. So our importance of managing these forest areas also includes managing these riparian streams for these other species. Immediately after the fire, we started with our partners to look at the severity of the burn and ways that we could assess the effectiveness of our treatments. So from here on, you're going to probably see we'll provide some science behind what we've been doing and how we've been looking at these relationships of burn severity and treatments. There are a lot of ways of looking at fire severity, and I'm going to show you a few of those as we work through these. But what you can see on the left is that the proportion of the area burned with untreated and thinned, and basically these are very much the same kind of results. Where we had used controlled burning or thinning and controlled burning, as has been suggested earlier, we basically saw similar kinds of conditions. So the importance of fire really in this situation can't be understated. On the right side, I also wanted to just show that some people talk about the char on the bole of the tree as being a way of monitoring burn severity or intensity. And so this is just an example of looking at that relationship and seeing that those line up quite well. Now, this is another part of a research project I'm involved with at this time. And we're basically looking at quantifying at a landscape scale the severity of these types of fires. And so the RD and BR basically is a way of looking at the difference normalized burn ratio before and after vegetation changes. And so using that as an indicator of the severity of this fire, we were then able to use that to first of all, establish what were the major environmental variables that were affecting fire behavior, fire severity. And so you can see that kind of in the orangish color, fire weather, and as Kerry was talking about earlier, there are some things we aren't going to be able to change. This fire weather condition is one of the most dominant factors in this analysis, and it continues, I think, will be a part of where we go forward. Evaporative stress index, relative humidity, fuel moisture, these kinds of things are going to continue to be in these hot, dry conditions. We do have the ability to control our canopy cover, canopy height, those kinds of things. So what we can manage and what we have to work within. So that's a way of establishing the significance of these factors on fire behavior. Then we took that information and then we stratified the entire Bootleg area, 450,000 acres, into these pixels or parcels that are about 220 acres in size. And then within those, we're able to then look at these effects of treatments and fire behavior. So in figure C there, what you can see is that the thin and burn areas, those are basically that yellow line going, the dotted line going across is at 240. So that's everything below that is low severity. And so the thin and burn areas were almost all of low severity. And also in the areas where we had used prescribed fire previous, those were almost, over 70% of that is in low severity. Contrary to the paper Kerry was talking about with Davis et al., the thinning and fuel treatment. So where we had pile burning, those didn't really have any difference in our situation and fire behavior. And many situations where we had previously done thinning, pile burn, and had piles established for pile burning, in those situations, we didn't see any difference really in the severity of the burn. And then in our fourth graph here, again, somewhat contrary to the information in Davis et al., where we've done burning, we find, as an example with the 2008 controlled burn, we see situations where even 10 plus years after the fire, after our prescribed burning, we're still seeing low severity in those areas. the areas where we had done thinning and these fuel treatments were all above into the moderate to high severity. So contrary to some of the other literature that's out there, just to give an example that, you know, as Kerry eloquently described, it depends. I want to transition a little bit now then into our situation and how we've been looking at developing these relationships, how to manage these forests, and how we've been quantifying these different ecological relationships. So for almost 20 years, we've been developing this fire stewardship program, which includes providing fuels training, on the ground burning, fuels monitoring. The center picture there in the middle is with Susan Pritchard and her team as we've been redeveloping some of the fuel models that are used in developing our fire behavior and prescribed fire programs. Working with universities to continue to advance our knowledge and understanding of fire behavior. And the top right corner there is a composite burn index. We've been doing composite burn index data collections for almost 20 years in these areas, almost since it was established. And so this is really the foundation of a lot of the work that we're doing at this time. The second part then is looking at forest structure and composition. So we're working with the University of Washington, a number of graduate students there, papers you all have seen, I'm sure, but looking at this historic forest structure and composition. So going back into the 1850s again, talking about what were these forests like at that time, how were they managed, and what were the features. And the factor, what we're really looking at here is looking about this structural pattern within the landscape. And so we've been actually have like 14 of these sites within our area that we've been using as references for how we're managing the forest. And this actually you'll see then is that water balance deficit of about 203 in actual evaporative. So we're looking at these different relationships, both in biophysical setting or these climate water balance relationships. And the reason we're doing that is we're really finding a very strong relationship in the Klamath Basin to water balance deficit and plant associations. So in the drier sites, we can find how these are basically stratifying by water balance deficit. And the fact of the stratification is one thing because it's going to talk about species composition and plant associations, but it also gives us more information about this historic structure associated with these plant associations. And so in the drier sites where there are fewer trees, we actually have clumping patterns much different, more trees in these larger clumps, which actually then gives us more space between the trees. And that space between the trees is essential for biodiversity, for water storage, for the trees themselves and their health. Here's an example then where we've been using controlled burning only. And just for reference, talking about controlled burning, height of the char on the bowl, that level there. But then when the bootleg fire came through, and this is a picture of the bootleg fire afterwards, showing that we've got actually lower bowl char or lower severity with the bootleg fire than with prescribed fire.
Craig, just about 2 more minutes left. If you could start wrapping up. Thank you.
Thank you. This example then shows where we've got that relationship of clumping patterns to height of the char on the bowl. And then after where we hadn't basically had the opportunity to use controlled burning, that thinning expressing itself with much greater severity there in the single trees. Looking quickly then at flowering and basically reestablishing these plantations, we've been monitoring environmental conditions, looking at cone development and flowering. And the point I want to bring here is that where we've been able to monitor these different conditions, so where we've had ecological harvest, prescribed burning, and then wildfire, we've basically been finding that seedlings have been establishing themselves quite significantly across all these different conditions. But proportional to that clumping pattern, that's a log relationship on the right showing that we're basically finding that the density or that clumping pattern is critical for reestablishing ponderosa pine seedlings. And then here is just an example then of where we've been reestablishing this forest structure, looking at composition. 80% of this forest is still in trees over 150 years of age. We've got a clumping pattern that's actually more so than it was in 1850, but a greater tree size and very, very good condition. So this is just my wrap up of saying these are the partners and the relationships we've had over this time. It's extensive, and I want to thank everyone for their contributions here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Craig. And again, just more evidence of the importance of fire on these landscapes for our forest health and vigor of our forest. So up next, we have Andrew Merschel. Andrew is an ORISE postdoctoral fellow working with the U.S. Forest Service P&W Research Station and also Oregon State University. Andrew uses tree rings to develop a shared understanding of how different forest ecosystems function over time. Andrew is particularly interested in how disturbances, mostly fire, and forest management have shaped and will continue to shape forest ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. So Andrew, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Kerry, and thanks everyone for having me today. We're going to change pace a little bit now and move to the west side of the Cascades. What I have for you today is kind of a quick summary of a lot of new fire histories in the Western Cascades and Douglas fir Western hemlock ecosystems. That's really going to help refine and update our understanding of historical fire regimes and for successional dynamics that were modified by historical fires. I think this connects well to the Forest Health State of the State Conference because fire is a disturbance process that sets up a cascade and predisposes trees to other disturbances from root pathogens and insects. And then also the nature over fire in a forest ecosystem over time is going to shape the structure of the stands and also their composition, which has implications for what roots and pathogens will operate in those stands over time. So I like to start out with saying that infrequent high severity fire is definitely a part of the historical fire regime in the Western Cascades and Oregon Coast Range. Today's presentation isn't to say it's not, but I think that these fire events that are high severity that happen during severe east winds have really shaped largely how we think about fire regimes on the west side and maybe have had us not look more at the more frequent low and moderate severity fires that used to happen in Douglas fir systems. So again, just a lot of evidence for these infrequent high severity fires during severe east winds like the 2020 fires, the Tillamook fires, and the Yakult fire in 1902. So these fires are really impactful and they're seared in our mind, and I think they've largely shaped how we think about succession and the development of old forest conditions in our Douglas fir Western hemlock systems. Under the infrequent high severity fire model, what we have is a stand initiating after a high severity fire with a pioneer cohort of Douglas fir. As that pioneer cohort starts to grow up, the trees in that cohort start to compete with each other, and they start to be picked off by within stand disturbances, insects, and disease, basically dying from competition. As they die and create gaps in the stand, that provides an opportunity for shade-tolerant species like Western hemlock, Pacific silver fir to move into the understory. And over time, this gap succession process in the stand starts to develop a multi-layered old growth structure that has that multi-layered structure, also the horizontal canopy gaps, and a mixture of different tree species. So this is sort of the successional model or paradigm we have for Douglas fir forest developing with infrequent high severity fire. But what we're learning is that forest succession and fire regimes are probably much more diverse in Douglas fir ecosystems. And so this is just a model developed by Alan Tepley. What he did is he cored lots of different stands in the central Cascades Willamette National Forest area. And he looked at the development histories of those stands. And what he was on to is that there's probably several different development pathways. And much of the forest in his study area was developed through either moderately frequent non-stand replacing fire or frequent low severity fire. So our current work is expanding our fire history records more broadly across the region to better understand this mix of different fire regimes on the west side. So what we're doing here is we're taking a regional approach. The map on the left is showing you the distribution of new fire history plots that have been placed in about the past 5 or so years. You can see that we have a coverage going from the Umpqua National Forest up into the Gifford Pinchot, a few sites in the MBS, and then there's also another fire history study on the Central Oregon Coast Range on the Elliott State Forest. So at each of these sites, what we do is we take cross sections out of stumps from around 20 trees that have evidence of fire on them. The evidence of fire that we're looking for are cambial fire scars. They're a fire injury that's very specific to fire, and we can use that injury to know the exact year of past fires. So an important point about this work is this is the first time fire history has been done in this sort of rigorous way in forest ecosystems that are this cool and moist in the Pacific Northwest. So the current graph, what I'm showing is precipitation on the y-axis, temperature on the x-axis, and what you're seeing there is the climate space in Western North America. The small triangles on that graph represent the temperature and precipitation of sites where we've previously done cross-dated fire histories in North America. Now I'm showing you where these West Side fire history sites are. So you can see that we're sampling sort of the same temperature space, but we're in ecosystems that have much more precipitation than in places where we've done fire history before. So at each one of these sites, again, we're getting this information usually from clear cuts and finding stumps with evidence of fire on them and then removing cross sections from these stumps. So once we remove the cross sections, we take them to OSU, we sand them to a high polish, and then we date every single ring on each cross section to its exact year. And that allows us to date the exact year of each fire that's recorded on the cross section. So this is just an example of one cross section collected near Loon Lake, Oregon, for the Elliott State fire history. And you can see that this tree recorded fires in 1541, 1628, 1652, 1751, 1831, 1872, and 1889. And each one of those fire injuries is very specific to fire again. I could talk more about that at the end if there's questions on what fire scars are and how they form. So now I'm going to launch into giving you guys sort of a summary of some general trends or fire history types that we're seeing on the west side in the Western Cascades. This is just to sort of give you guys an idea of the range of different fire histories that we're finding in Douglas fir and Western hemlock forest. The first site that I'm going to summarize for you is Site 71. This is on the North Santiam River, just to the east of Detroit, Oregon, and this site experienced stand replacing fire in 2020. They did some salvage to protect trees that would have been falling on the highway at this site, so it provided a really good opportunity to build a long fire record within those salvaged trees. So we know this site burned at high severity in 2020, but our question here is, what was the nature of fire as this old forest developed historically? So I'm showing you here that record for that site on this current graph. This graph has an x-axis that is time, and then each tree that we sectioned at this site has its own timeline. So the very first line here is a Douglas fir that's established in about 1640. And you can see all the different trees are mapped out going up across the graph. The red triangles on this graph are fire scars recorded by the trees we sampled at that site. So what I see here is that this site probably had a stand replacing disturbance in sometime around 1640. After that stand replacing fire, indicated by this red arrow, you had an initial pioneer cohort of Douglas fir established on the site. During its first 100 years of development, this stand had at least 4 fires as it was developing. One of those fires resulted in another cohort. And then you can see another fire event in the early 1800s and late 1790s that resulted in a third cohort. Overall, the pattern of fire at this site was, this is a Douglas fir Western hemlock on the Willamette Forest, on the Willamette National Forest, that had very frequent fire historically up until the late 19th century, and then much less frequent fire over the 20th century. So this type of fire pattern, we generally see this at lower elevation Douglas fir Western hemlock sites that are along major rivers like the Santiam River, the Cowlitz River, or the McKenzie River. So this is typically where we see this frequent pattern of fire that becomes less frequent as we move into the present. Next site I want to show you gives you an idea of what we often find at sort of moist Western hemlock Douglas fir sites at higher elevations. So this is another site in the Willamette National Forest. at about 3,800 feet of elevation on the Willamette National Forest. And so here's the history of how old forest developed at this site. This site probably had a stand replacing disturbance in about 1564. I don't know the exact year of that fire. That's an estimate. And then after that, you see the establishment of a pioneer cohort of Douglas fir. And then within the first 100 years of stand development at this site, there were 3 additional fires. So I would call these reburns of what's a young Douglas fir forest. Now, here's something really interesting we see in these more moist western hemlock sites. You can have a period of quite frequent fire, and then you can have a period that lasts a century or more without frequent fire at the same site. So a really critical thing that we're finding is that fire frequency is variable over time at these sites, meaning you don't really have a mean fire return interval. Depending on stand age or what people are doing fire, how they're using fire, or climate, fire return intervals in this type of western hemlock forest seem to be variable over time. Lastly, we can go to the highest elevation sites in the Pacific silver fir zone, in that area that gets a permanent snowpack. And these are places where we often see much less fire. So just an example here of a stand that burned severely sometime in the 13th century, a cohort of Douglas fir established after that. We only picked up 1 fire scar at this site in the past 800 years or so. So this really fits the model of infrequent stand replacing fire at this site. So those sites were provided just to give you guys an idea of tremendous variation in what the fire regime was in what we call the Douglas fir region. Next, I wanted to just give you a look at what a bunch of different fire histories within a smaller area look like in Douglas fir system. So this is on the Oregon Coast Range on the Elliott State Forest. And I'm going to be talking about fire history sites that were set up on a 4x4 grid on the Elliott State Forest and surrounding lands. And so this is a fire record for just one of those sites. Again, we're showing an individual tree timeline, and then the red triangles indicate fires. What I want to point out again here is this variable fire frequency over time. In this case, we see pretty frequent fire from 1550 up to 1712, and then a gap from 1712 to 1849 with no fire at this site. So I think it's pretty interesting that this pattern sort of holds across the whole Elliott State Forest fire reconstruction area. When you look at all the sites that are now represented on this graph, they also less fire activity from sort of the late 1700s to about 1850, when there's a large fire in 1849 at this site. So I think that this pattern of variable fire frequency over time in these west side forests is probably a function of individual landscapes. It could be that it depends on fuel conditions in that landscape, or it could be it depends on how people are either using fire or not using fire in that landscape over time. So one of the key points I wanted to point out today is that we're finding evidence that reburns are really common in Douglas fir western hemlock ecosystems following a high severity fire. So this graph here on the left is just showing you the number of fires we're seeing in stands during their first century of development following a high severity fire. So most of the stands have at least one reburn, and many of them have several reburns during their first century of development. There's a lot of other evidence that shows this happening in more recent fires. So if you think about the Tillamook fire, that was a fire that reburned quite frequently after the initial high severity fire. Same thing happened in the Occult fire. So not only do we see this in the tree ring record, but we see it with many of our other more recent east wind fire events that early seral Douglas fir forests seem to have higher fire frequency over time. So why might this be? There's good evidence that flammability is higher in early seral Douglas fir forests. And so this happens for several different reasons. The first one would be that the microclimate in an early seral Douglas fir system is much different. So you're going to have higher temperatures, lower humidity, and higher wind speeds in an early successional stand after fire. You're also going to have fuels coming down from the forest that was killed, and you're going to have lots of early seral fuels in the understory. So that combination of a more flammable microclimate and flammable fuels means that these stands probably burn under a broader range of weather conditions or climate conditions when they're young as opposed to mature and old. So just graph here on the left is showing some research by AG, showing how flammability in terms of rate of spread and flame length decreases in these Douglas fir systems as they mature over time. Another really important finding for these West Side fire histories is that Indigenous fire stewardship was essential to cultural resources in moist forests in the Pacific Northwest. If you look at ethnographic records and you look at Indigenous knowledge, this has been said for a long time, that fire wasn't just a partner used to steward landscapes in dry forests or in the oak systems in the Willamette valleys. It was also used in moist systems. So that's another reason that we're probably seeing quite a bit of variability in fire frequency over time. It depends on how people were using fire and how the practice of indigenous fire stewardship was removed by settler colonialism and then by fire exclusion. So this is another reason for variable fire frequency, and probably a good reason we're seeing lots more fire than many people expect in these West Side fire ecosystems. So just to highlight this, I like to bring up this site. It's called Oak Flat. It's on the Umpqua National Forest. It's on the edge of the Douglas fir Western Hemlock Zone. And what you're seeing here is a stand. I think this was brought up as sort of classic Southwestern Oregon, of Douglas fir that are right about 110 years old. Those Douglas fir are quite small for 110-year-old Douglas fir trees. They're quite dense, and you can see on the ground there old dead ponderosa pine, sugar pine, and white oak that historically occupied this site in a much more open woodland condition. So at this type of site, we're finding pretty convincing evidence that the development and maintenance of old growth Oregon white oak, sugar pine, ponderosa pine, and Douglas fir was part of Indigenous fire stewardship. So as we think of how we conserve old trees in these West Side ecosystems, one of the ways these old trees and those species were there was because of Indigenous fire stewardship. So just a graph that I think helps me make this case. This is the fire record combined with a climate record at that Oak Flat site. The red shading here is showing you hot, dry conditions. The blue shading is showing you cool, wet conditions. And the blue dots in this case are the fires. What you can see on this graph is tremendous fire frequency at this Oak Flat site. In the previous picture, prior to 1856, there was a fire at least every 3 years at that site. And you can see that fires happen in both cool, wet conditions and hot, dry conditions. So no relationship between these fires and climate, which suggests that this is cultural fire. And you can also see that there's this period from 1800 to 1820 where there's very cool, moist conditions in the Pacific Northwest. Normally, you do not find fire in this period, but this site burns 9 times during 1800 to 1820. You can also see that after the forceful removal of Indigenous people to reservations in 1856 in this area, there's a dramatic drop off in fire frequency, and fires are now only occurring during drought conditions. So these are multiple lines of evidence that really support that the old ponderosa pine, cedar, and white oak at this site and sugar pine were stewarded by Indigenous fire stewardship. Another wrap-up point I'd like to make here is a critical thing we're finding is that fire was important for mediating succession in many old growth Douglas fir forests in the Western Cascades. Just an example here, this is a site at about 4,000 feet. It gets 86 inches of annual precipitation. It has 800-year-old Douglas fir in it. The cedar that you're seeing in the photo established after a fire in 1759. And this site burned in 1836, 1844, and 1883. So the development of old growth structure and composition at this site wasn't part of a gap process. It was succession was actually mediated by fire. And that's how you got to a mixed aged and mixed species stand that you're seeing in these photos. I think I'm out of time. So I have some summary preliminary findings that I can send out, and then just a wrap up here, a nod to all the different people who've been contributing to these West Side fire histories and the work I was summarizing there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. Due to time, we're just going to roll right into the next speaker, who is John Kim. John is an ecological modeler with the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center and with the Pacific Northwest Research Station. He studies climate change impacts on vegetation using dynamic global vegetation models and wildfire simulations. He has a PhD in fisheries and wildlife management from the University of Massachusetts and an MS in computer science from the University of Massachusetts and a BA in computer science from the University of California, San Diego. So thank you, John. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you for that introduction. I hope you can hear me fine. And thank you for giving me your time today. I am with the Forest Service with the PNW Research Station. And my hope today is to kind of give you both a broad overview of the kind of future fire simulations that I am working on with specific examples to anchor some of that, the broad overview. The studies that we have done in and around the Pacific Northwest has documented a definite temperature rise in the last 100 years at many different weather locations. So climate change is definitely happening, and under some of the future projections, it's expected to accelerate. And if you look at the evidence coming out of global climate models that simulate global climate, the projected climate change for this particular region is for as much as a 4-degree Celsius rise in temperature in the next by the end of this century. While the precipitation projections remain fairly uncertain. It's a little unclear whether it's going to be a lot wetter or a lot drier, although most of the climate models agree that the seasonal amplitude of very wet winters and dry summers will likely increase. And in fact, we looked at some of the future climate of the Blue Mountains ecoregion going into the end of the century. And we try to find where there are similar climate today for the future. And actually it is to be found all over the Pacific Northwest on the west side, as well as the deep Southwest. So what this tells us is that under this particular climate scenario, the future for the Blue Mountains will be very different than what it is today. So that kind of sets the stage for the kind of fire modeling that we do under future climate scenarios. And I kind of also wanted to give a little bit of a framework to think about fire models. There are all kinds of different ways that scientists try to create projections of future wildfire conditions. And you could think of it kind of along two different axes. One is that, in this diagram, there are models that along the x-axis here that kind of try to project conditions at a very coarse scale. So looking at regional or even continental scale average conditions. And then there are models that try to create projections that are very fine scale, site by site, or on a grid, in a grid, it could be as fine as hundreds of meters as opposed to hundreds of kilometers. And then you could also think of it in terms of the y-axis here, which is that there are models that look for correlation between climate conditions, soils, vegetation, and fire. And then there are models that try to simulate very mechanistic cause and effect type of relationships. So, for example, it might be trying to simulate, ignition and then the spread fire spread over the landscape and its effects on the vegetation. So the kind of models that I've worked with kind of occupy the kind of the middle ground here, the terrestrial biome models, which kind of work in that middle resolution, and the FSIM large fire model, which is both very mechanistic and very fine scale. And an example of kind of that middle ground model is a model called MC2 Dynamic Global Vegetation Model. And I've run that for the Conservancy USA. And that was, I believe, at 1/16 degree resolution, which is about 6 kilometers grid cell. And that was, and those results suggest that in the Pacific Northwest, under a high warming climate change scenario, the carbon stocks will both increase, but also fire activity will also increase alongside that. More recently, I've worked with a model called FSIM, Large Fire Model. And this is a model that simulates fire on a gridded landscape, a very fine scale gridded landscape. It's typically run between 120 to 270 meter resolution. And you give it a bunch of spatial data, including topography, fuels, etc. And then you also give it fire weather conditions. And then the simulation consists of simulating ignition randomly on the landscape, spreading it, and then also simulating some suppression activities and calculating flame lengths. And then in the thing that's kind of unique to FSIM is that it runs those simulations year by year, 1 year at a time, stepping through all the days of the year, but it does that 10,000 times to generate, to take all of that 10,000 years worth of output and generate a kind of a probabilistic estimate of where, which pixels the fire is likely to spread into and what kind of flame lengths it'll have. So what we've done that is a little bit unique compared to other FSIM simulations is that we have driven these with climate projections, future climate projections from global climate models. And we have repeated that with multiple global climate models to obtain a picture of how future fire conditions or fire results would be like in different parts of the Conservancy USA. We've done that for Southern California, and more recently, we've done it for the Pacific Northwest. In fact, this paper just came out a few days ago, and this picture kind of captures one of the main results that's described in that paper. So if you look at the center, upper center panel there that says contemporary baseline, that is the simulated wildfire risk for all of the west side of the Pacific Northwest, with the more orange colors representing higher fire frequency, and the red blobs are the actual observed fires in the past. And then the panels that are surrounding that center panel are the future. This is for the future in this case is for mid-century, which is about a 30-year period surrounding year 2050. And the main thing that emerges from these simulations is that for every part of the landscape in the Pacific Northwest that we simulated, fire activity is going to increase. So for example, if you look at the Oregon Coast Range in the bottom left panel, compared to the center panel, there's a lot more yellow. So like a lot more light yellow, for example. And the burn probability, the simulated burn probability for mid-century is about 0.003. That's about a 0.3%. And for a very wet coastal forest ecosystem, that is quite a lot of fire. In fact, if you think of it, in terms of, a homeowner who might have a home in somewhere in that ecosystem, in your 30-year mortgage period, there's a 1 in 10 chance that the place that you stand in is going to experience a fire. If you summarize the projected change in fire activity for all 5 of the ecoregions that we simulated, as wet as some of those systems are, the future projections show just a tremendous increase in fire activity. So if you take all of the Olympic and Puget Lowlands as a unit, the present day fire rotation, that is the amount of time it takes to burn all of that landscape, is 11,000 years. So it's a very, infrequent, a very non-burning system. Yet under our climate change scenario simulations, that is cut to 1/10 of that, to the fire rotation being 1,235 years. So that's a really big overall increase in fire activity in that system. And what we uncover through our detailed simulations is that not only is there just going to be more of the same kind of fire, but the fire regime itself is going to change. And what that means is that when and where and how big of those fires is going to change. So taking again let's take the Washington North Cascades as an example. And by the way, in the publication we have this kind of chart for all 5 of the ecoregions, but I like picking on this one because these show the greatest regime shifts. But the dots basically are the future fire activity for each of the GCM based simulations. And what the dots show is, and the black line is the contemporary conditions. And what the dots show is that there can be, this is a scenario, there can be a great increase. I'm sorry, let me correct that. The black line is the median of the futures, the dotted line is the contemporary conditions. So in the top left, for example, in the Olympics, the dotted line, contrast the dotted line with the colored dots as well as the black solid line. That shows a great increase in springtime fires. And then in the North Cascades, there's a great increase in both the springtime fires and fall fires. And the colored dots, as I said, represents different GCMs. And what's interesting there is that the blue dots, which are GCMs that are considered to be better predictors of climate for this region than the red dots, they actually tend to estimate even higher fire increases for the region than the poorer performing GCMs. So for this, to kind of wrap up this part, but as well as to kind of segue into the next part, I wanted to kind of editorialize and give you this quote that I really like to think about. This is from a seminal book written many decades ago about the structure of scientific revolutions. And this is where the phrase paradigm shift comes from. And the phrase is that, well, the sentence is that truth emerges more readily from error than from confusion. And the reason why I say that is because, these are models and these are also scenarios, and they are not a crystal ball of the future. The models themselves, have lots of things that could be improved upon, and the scenario themselves are not perfect predictions of the future. But by constructing the model and looking at the logical consequences of all the things that we know, we create a picture of the future, and it stimulates us to think about what the future might look like. And that's the value of these models. And so for this next part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the different facets of climate and fire science. And one of the things that we are learning is that the global climate models that are used to project future, there's kind of a genealogy of how they themselves have evolved. And depending on which GCMs you kind of focus on and how it's related to another, that may affect the ensemble of results that you're obtaining. So if you pick GCMs that are highly related, that may give you one set of results than picking GCMs that have been developed very independently. Another important facet that I've been involved in is comparing downscaled climate data sets. The GCMs simulate global climate in a very coarse manner, and then there's a certain science and a technique to downscale them and to fine scale. And we're finding that has choosing which one to use, that has an important effect as well. And there's also an important body of work that shows that for predicting future fire, vegetation matters. How what kind of vegetation and therefore fuel conditions you estimate for the future, that has a great impact. And this is for the Malheur National Forest, where we compared 3 different land models, and some things agree, and then some things are very different. And then another facet that could be really important is that global change in fires change the global forestry and timber market dynamics, which in turn come all the way back to affecting U.S. markets as well as land manager choices. Future wildfire simulation output can be used to analyze how different buildings are exposed for today and into the future, as well as being used by the U.S. Forest Service to identify key locations to study and plan for scenarios. We've also done some work to identify potential disaster scenarios in the Pacific Northwest. What we've learned from that is that if you look at wildfires in a very like an insurance company, just in terms of a probability, you may be focused on some of the communities that are up in the Cascades. But if you look at it just purely in terms of where can large disasters happen, regardless of probability, a lot of those communities are actually located right down in through the Puget Trough and Willamette Valley. Just quickly, we've also looked at where wildfire, where evacuation from wildfires might be a great factor, and we've actually ranked top 100 rural communities that are exposed to both high wildfire risk and really poor road network conditions. And what emerged from that is that some of the coastal communities are, at risk, as well as, in Eastern Oregon, which I think that's something that probably everybody knew.
Hey, John, just to let
Yeah.
you know, you are at time, so if you could just wrap it up and then we'll have to move on to our next speaker.
All right, I think I'm done. I'll just leave a parting thought, which is that, these disasters seem like they're really not going to happen, and then they happen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. There is one question in the Q&A, and I think that's for you, John, if you wouldn't mind going in and typing an answer to that, because we're going to roll right into hearing from Margaret, who has been a host and a moderator and all things for this conference. Just in brief, to let you know, Margaret holds a graduate certificate and bachelor's degree in forestry from Michigan State University and brings a diverse background to her role as the Forest Landowner Education Manager with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. Her experience includes roles with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, consulting forestry, and hands-on positions as a field and conservation district forester. As a certified forester, she is passionate about sustainable forest management and excels in simplifying complex forestry concepts, which she'll demonstrate here in the next slide, enabling landowners to make smart, confident decisions about their land. Thank you so much, Margaret.
Yes, and can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect. And you're seeing my slides okay?
I sure am.
Okay. Yeah, this is going to be a super quick presentation. And really the goal of this is to just kind of highlight the delicate balance that exists here. And I'd like to start by taking a moment to sort of reflect on the Forest Health in Oregon State of the State 2024 conference, this webinar that you were just on for the past 2 days. So throughout the past 2 days, we've gained some, insights into the challenges that our forests face here in Oregon. Those challenges range from pests and diseases to invasive species. And all of that, which we just learned, is exacerbated by ongoing issues with drought and climate change. And this, this delicate balance that we have here really requires bringing people together to talk about, management options and navigating sort of those complexities that exist and talking about the trade-offs and the co-benefits of the various management strategies that we use, including things like prescribed fire, which obviously stands out as a pivotal tool that could be used to help maintain forest health. But with it also comes with its own sets of complexities and, work that has to be continued to be navigated. And ultimately, there's so much good work happening in Oregon based on this coming together of various groups that are all trying to make that effort to enhance our resiliencies. One big one is the Oregon Department of Forestry. They have their 20-year landscape resilience strategy. This landscape resilience strategy relies on shared stewardships that unites diverse stakeholders to work collaboratively and to find that holistic approach that sort of weighs those trade-offs and co-benefits. Additionally, ODF provides a wealth of resources about best management practices, especially post-fire forest health. And as we heard from Kerry earlier today, they are establishing the Oregon Certified Burn Manager Program, which promotes the safe use of prescribed fire across Oregon. Complementing that is the State Fire Marshal's office is now offering defensible SACE programs, which includes free assessments to help property owners create spaces that can withstand wildfires. They've also made available a comprehensive defensible space technical guide. And then acknowledging the health risks associated with wildfire and smoke, the Oregon Health Authority and the Department of Environmental Quality develop and maintain educational resources on this front. They encourage residents to stay informed about air quality through the Oregon Smoke blog and to develop community response plans. to aid in the communication on the importance of prescribed good fire, as well as, building community resilience in this space. The Oregon Department of Agriculture is also proactively protecting the state's natural resources from insects and pests, which, as we've learned throughout this webinar, can, obviously exacerbate wildfires when those conditions exist. And they've been working closely on response efforts, including incineration of EAB and MOB. Additionally, there's groups like OSU Extension Services and the Fire Program, which is actively involved in like regional forestry and fire work, and providing, education resources, including the FireAware, Fire Prepared packets, which they've created. Initiatives are happening, outside of just state agencies. We also have the Oregon Prescribed Fire Council, which is advocating for the use of responsible prescribed fire in fire adapted ecosystems. So ultimately, these are just some of the initiatives that are happening across the state, but this is a truncated list, and I definitely encourage you to kind of look and seek out additional resources out there, because they are all very important in kind of striking that balance and working together collaboratively to protect Oregon's forests. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Julie, who's going to do some closing remarks and launch our closing polls.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Kerry, for hosting that session. And we just want to say thank you to all of our presenters for sharing their expertise. Thank you to all of our partners for their contributions into helping make this conference such a success. Thank you to all of you for attending and your engaging questions. Over the last 2 days, we've heard about many of the forest health challenges that Oregon faces. We've also heard from dedicated professionals who are working together to provide solutions and research. And we heard about how each of us can play a part in being aware and notifying about invasive species. And this is a really important conference that has traditionally been occurred about every 2 years. And thanks in large part to Dave Shaw and his leadership. And we aim to continue working with partners to keep this momentum going. And we'd invite, if any of you would like to be part of this current organizing group, to get in touch with us if you're interested. And we'd like to close out today with really wanting to recognize Dave Shaw for his years of service. Dave has been an advocate and has worked passionately for forest health in Oregon and forest pathology. He's a mentor for many and an admired educator. And we just want to thank you, Dave, for all the years of analyzing dead and dying trees and still being optimistic that solutions can be found and we won't be taken over by pests. And as exhibited by this conference, just coming in and always wanting to get people together. So really appreciate it, Dave, and we wish you all the best in your next endeavor of retirement. And I will give you the last word of the conference, although they warn against doing that to people who are retiring because you don't have much to hold back. But this is your, we just want to say thank you, Dave. And if you'd like to share any last words, we'd welcome you to do so.
Oh, well, thank you very much. That's really nice of you. And well, I just want to say that this webinar really illustrates the amazing work going on in Oregon. And I think even though we have all these challenges, I think we're working together, we can really meet these challenges. And I think everyone who spoke today and yesterday is all a part of that, and everyone in the audience. So thank you all very much. And this was a fantastic webinar.
Thanks, Dave. Well, we'll just give a few more seconds for people to finish out. Looks like a few people are still in the survey. So we'll hang here for a few minutes. And thanks everyone for coming and joining us this and have a good rest of your afternoon. And we'll let this play for just another minute to make sure everyone has a chance to complete the poll and survey and get, especially if you want to continue education credit. So thanks again for all these great questions and engagement. And I know many of our folks who would also like to, maybe if you have follow-up questions, many of them will be available to probably get in touch if you have those follow-up questions that come up. As well with the videos will be available and posted on the Know Your Forest website I know sometimes there's a lot of great information and you'd like to go back and review those. Well, just give us a few weeks to get that completed. So thanks again, everyone, for coming, and we will let the survey play out for another minute, and then we'll close out the webinar. Thank you.